Have you ever wondered why an acupuncturist insists on looking at your tongue to figure out how to treat your liver? It sounds kind of wild, right? Well, in this explainer, we're going to do something truly fascinating. We're translating the esoteric, often misunderstood language of ancient traditional medicine into modern scientific frameworks. We'll look at both its brilliant underlying logic and, to be fair, its very real methodological flaws. So get ready, we're looking at 2,000 years of history through the rigorous lens of 21st century science, decoding how these ancient practitioners were actually building complex systems models way before we even had the vocabulary for it.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the forest, not trees, then move on to function over form, explore the meridian network, get into the scientific critique, and finally wrap up with the modern synthesis. Let's just dive right in.
Section 1. The forest, not trees. Decoding the underlying logic.
To understand why ancient medical concepts seem so confusing or even mystical at first glance, we really have to start by looking at the forest, not just the individual trees. If you're staring at every single branch without understanding the root system, you're going to get lost. Just look at the comparison we have here. Modern Western medicine is deeply rooted in anatomy, right? It focuses almost exclusively on the physical hardware of our organs. If you ask a modern doctor what the liver is, they'll describe a 1.5 kilogram physical mass of tissue in your upper right abdomen. But ancient medicine, it completely ignores that hardware to focus on the functional software of interconnected systems. To them, the liver is an entire functional category governing your emotions, your physical traits, your energy flows. They're using the exact same word as the modern doctor, but describing a completely different concept. It's literally like comparing the physical hardware of your laptop directly to its invisible software.
All right, Section 2. Function over form. The language of systems.
So let's explore how this ancient framework prioritizes dynamic functional states over static physical forms, and specifically the language they use to describe it, because this is where people usually get tripped up. I want you to completely forget the popular pop culture idea of a mystical, magical energy field. Instead, think of qi purely as the functional state of a biological system. If you remember anything from advanced math or physics, think about the Fourier transform. It tells us that any complex chaotic wave can be mathematically broken down into a single foundational sine wave. Well, qi acts exactly like that foundational sine wave for the human body. It's just the fundamental underlying language used to describe whether a biological system is currently strong, weak, blocked, or flowing perfectly.
So, the really crucial point here is how these 5 systems act as holistic buckets. This framework perfectly binds an organ, a psychological emotion, and a physical trait together into one unified category. For instance, check out the wood system there in the table. It binds the liver, the emotion of anger, and the physical trait of your tendons and nails into one interconnected group. Think about how this plays out today. A modern doctor might send you to a hepatologist for your liver, a therapist for your anger, and an orthopedist because your tendons ache, and you'll be paying 3 different copays for 3 different visits. But this ancient system insists they're all just different expressions of the exact same bucket. If you're constantly angry and your joints ache, ancient medicine sees one single root functional cause, not 2 completely separate diseases.
Now, you might be wondering, how did they figure all this out without microscopes or blood tests? Well, it wasn't magic. It was built through an ancient, incredibly rigorous method known as Shang Shu Li. Step 1 is Shang, centuries of strictly observing external symptoms, carefully tracking things like skin color, the subtle rhythm of a pulse, shifts in emotions. Step 2 is Shu, accumulating massive amounts of cross-generational trial and error data. And finally, Step 3, Li, extracting those observations and data points into foundational theoretical laws. It's this continuous, logical loop of observation, data accumulation, and theory generation based entirely on centuries of documented human experience.
Which brings us to Section 3, the meridian network, connecting the isolated islands.
Okay, so how do these 5 isolated systems actually communicate with each other? I mean, if they're just 5 isolated buckets, you don't have a living human, you just have parts. The answer is the meridian network. Meridians act as the structural highways for this systemic energy. They form an active, interconnected network that bridges the deep internal organs with the surface of the body. They're essentially the communication lines, allowing, say, the liver system to talk to the spleen system. And notice the environmental inputs there. Meridians act as a direct interface, allowing your internal body to react to external environmental changes. It perfectly explains why your joints might suddenly ache right before it rains, or why your mood and energy completely shift when the seasons change. They're the network that brings the whole isolated system to life.
Moving on to Section 4, the scientific critique, boundaries and methodological flaws.
Now, as brilliant as this ancient systems thinking was, we have to be objective. We need to look at its real-world limitations and methodological flaws through a modern scientific lens. We really have to ask a hard question about what we call overfitting. In modern statistics and machine learning, overfitting happens when a model is so overly flexible that it perfectly explains all past data but fails entirely at predicting any new data. If an ancient theory can perfectly explain any symptom after the fact, by simply shrugging and saying, oh, it was too much yin or blocked qi, is it actually capable of predicting a future outcome? In modern science, a theory has to be falsifiable. If a framework just adapts to explain absolutely everything after the fact, it fails a basic test of scientific validity. It essentially predicts nothing.
Here we can contrast the precise, static photograph of Western reductionism with the dynamic movie of ancient medicine. Western medicine is a lot like taking a high-resolution photo with a precise biomarker, like logging a blood sugar reading of exactly 6.1. It's a crystal-clear moment in time. Ancient medicine, on the other hand, is like watching a movie of your overall functional trends. It's incredibly holistic and captures the whole process, but, and here's the catch, it unfortunately suffers from incredibly fuzzy operational boundaries. Without precise definitions of what constitutes a weak spleen versus a normal spleen, it's incredibly hard to objectively measure clinical outcomes. And that makes running double-blind, randomized modern clinical trials notoriously difficult, if not flat-out impossible.
We also have to acknowledge a major methodological flaw in the ancient accumulation of all this knowledge, and that's confirmation bias. Over thousands of years, successful treatments were meticulously recorded in these revered ancient texts. But as you can see with the circular logic here, successes were written down, but failures, they were essentially tossed in the bin. Often they were blamed on a practitioner's bad execution rather than a flaw in the theory itself. This creates a massive echo chamber. It completely overlooks the fact that many minor illnesses simply resolve because the body's natural immune system is doing its job. Or it overlooks the incredibly powerful psychological placebo effect, which is exactly what we're looking at with that glowing brain.
Furthermore, there's a pretty dangerous trend today where proponents try to use advanced supercomputers and AI to definitively prove these ancient networks are scientifically true just because they logically align with modern biological systems. But remember the golden rule of computing: garbage in, garbage out. You simply cannot use advanced math to validate an unverified biological premise. If you feed a flawed, unverified premise into an AI, it's just going to confidently hand you a highly articulate, flawed conclusion. Pointing out structural similarity does not equal proven biological mechanisms. Analogy is a fantastic spark for a new hypothesis, sure, but it is never a substitute for the hard grinding work of empirical proof.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, the modern synthesis, where ancient holism meets systems biology. Having looked closely at the flaws, we can now really appreciate the profound, verified value that this ancient framework brings to 21st century medicine. Modern systems biology relies heavily on the concept of emergence. This is the core idea that a whole system has completely new properties that its individual parts simply do not possess. For example, you can study a single hydrogen atom all day long, and you can study an oxygen atom all day long, but neither of them will help you understand the wetness of water. The wetness only emerges when they combine. And ancient practitioners instinctively understood this. They treated the whole human being because they knew the body was a unified emergent network, far greater and far more complex than just a collection of isolated organs.
And today, modern discoveries are actually providing tangible scientific counterparts to those ancient functional networks. Just take a look at the brain-gut axis, for example. We now know our intestinal microbiome directly affects our emotional mood. That perfectly mirrors ancient texts linking digestion and the heart. Or look at the body's fascia networks. These are continuous physical webs of connective tissue wrapping around our muscles and organs, and they heavily align with ancient meridian paths. Plus, we now intimately understand neuroendocrine axes and cellular gap junctions that allow instant body-wide hormonal communication. The ancient doctors brilliantly mapped the software. Modern science is finally finding the hardware to back it up.
This holistic view also maps perfectly onto the absolute cutting edge of modern predictive medicine. Think about how we usually treat illness today. We wait until we feel sick, and then we go to the doctor to get a pill. But the ancients focused on a concept called Zhui Bing, treating the disease before it ever arises. This shifts our focus from merely repairing broken parts to intervening long before symptoms ever appear. It's about looking at your daily sleep patterns and stress levels today to prevent a total systemic breakdown 5 years from now. It's about spotting micro-imbalances 7 days before severe symptoms bench you, and actively protecting the rest of your healthy systems immediately after an isolated illness takes root. So, what does this all mean for us? Well, the future of medicine isn't about choosing sides. It's certainly not about discarding modern life-saving anatomy for ancient theory, but it's also not about blindly ignoring systemic wisdom just for the sake of isolated, static data points. The true breakthrough lies in merging the incredibly precise, reductionist knowledge of our biological parts with the profound, dynamic wisdom of the whole. So, the next time you feel a symptom creeping up, I want to leave you with a question to think about. Are you just going to treat the isolated tree? Or are you finally ready to look at the health of your entire forest?